Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Tingstad. I'm the chair of the Business and Real Estate Group at Beresford booth. I'm here with my colleague, Per Oscarsson. Per and I are going to talk about business sales today. One of the things I find a lot in my practice is I do a ton of business sales. One of the things that I find is that understanding the process, particularly from a seller's perspective, there's a lot of lack of understanding out there about the process. It's really helpful if you can understand the process, because when you do, perhaps you can negotiate a better deal, at least have some confidence as you move forward. So Per and I kind of going to move forward in a bit of a question and answer sort of format. And I'm going to share my screen. Per, if you would, let me know, can you see that one?
Yes.
All right, very good. So want to first of all just kind of talk from a very high level about what the process looks like. And so here's the outline of the process. Obviously, you have to decide to sell. That can come across and happen in a number of ways. You need to have an interested buyer. Then typically what happens is you move to a confidentiality agreement with the prospective purchaser, then to a letter of intent, which are pretty simple documents, don't have a lot of teeth to them. But the definitive documentation, given the name, one might think there's a lot of teeth to it, and there is. So once the definitive documentation is done, then you move to closing, and what happens after closing is typically the seller may remain as an employee of the buyer or something along those lines. So this is what a typical sale process looks like. And where I'll go from here is to now get into some more of the details, starting with the desire or need to sell. For many business owners, this is something their business is what they've run as their livelihood for a long period of time. So it's kind of like selling your baby when it's time to sell. So that decision to sell can be a very emotional one. And that emotion can sometimes be driven by a need, for example, health of the business owners, or some financial problems associated with the business. And it is much, much, much better. And I don't know how many times I said much there, Per, but it is much better if instead of being driven by need, that the decision to sell is driven by a plan. And so rather than becoming ill and then deciding the need to sell is there, you'll do so much better, and you'll make so much better decision, maximize the value of your business when you have a plan associated with sell. And I did a webinar here a couple of months ago with friend and client Stacy Grund, and one of the questions I asked Stacy, Stacy's business has been in his family since the 1890s, so they've been at it for a while. And one of the questions I asked Stacy was this transferability process, even amongst a family, how long does that take? And Stacy made the comment that it was kind of a 10-year plan, and so that's a very long time. But I also find that's consistent with my practice. That it just takes a while once you make that decision to transfer your business, to get all your ducks in a row, so to speak. And so it really is, like I say, an emotional decision, and one that really should be approached with great care because of the significance of that decision.
David, one of the things I was wondering about, though, in your practice, and we're going basically from the seller's perspective here, but how many transactions on a sale of a business do you see, or have you heard about, where the transaction is actually initiated by the buyer, where the seller may not have ever had an interest in selling at that particular time, but someone comes up with an offer and the seller says, man, this might be a really good time to do this, even though I may not have had any plans at the moment to do it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I would say, that's probably, I don't know, 40, 50% of the time that a business is sold where the seller is approached, and then they, think about it and think about it and think about it. And that's when the decision to sell actually occurs, when a purchaser is sitting there, out of the blue, where there's not a market, or the business hasn't been marketed. And all of a sudden, they're sort of taken aback. And I think that's interesting as well, because if you haven't approached it uh, uh, methodically, now all of a sudden that buyer is ahead of the seller. And
Hmm.
so oftentimes the seller is at a disadvantage. And so I do think it's one, again, having a plan for how it's going to occur, because when those opportunities become available, you want to be in a position to maximize that. And if you haven't prepared for it, then you're probably not in a good position really to maximize that opportunity. But nevertheless, I think you're right. It happens a great deal of time, and it may even be a majority, but I would say it's 40 to 50% at least.
And I could see particularly in the family business context, if you haven't done the family business succession planning and now you get a great offer from outside, there could be a lot of family dynamics that are weighing on that decision, because now you may not, as the owner, or maybe the majority owner, may not have known that family members are really interested in eventually taking this over. And now you're faced with, gee, on the one hand, I got the family saying this, but on the other hand, I've got this great offer, which of course family may say, yeah, that's great. Let's do that. We're not that interested in taking over, but I can see where that's going to cause a big issue.
No, it really does. Yeah, and again, that's all part of having that plan. And so you can have that conversation with the next generation. Are you interested, or being prepared? So it's not just part of the plan if they're going to take it over. Well, what if they're not? And you're right.
Right.
If you have a family member who's interested in taking over the business and they don't even get the opportunity, that really
Yep.
can cause some hard feelings. So that's a great point. So it is not an easy thing to do, and there are a lot of different drivers for it. But be prepared for it. One of the things I always talk about is, hey, you gotta prepare for the end, because your business will end at some point. And so whether that's because of health or other reasons, so plan for it, and get ready. And it is not a short run process for sure. So once that emotional decision has been made, to Per's point, maybe that decision is made because a buyer is knocked on the door unsolicited. But other ways that happens, if you want to sell your business, there certainly are business brokers out there who do a great deal of these kinds of things. They're great at finding buyers. So that's one way that businesses market themselves. And another way is you talk to competitors, and when you have a kind of relationship with a competitor that you can have a conversation about challenges that you're having or whatever it might be. Competitors are a great source of prospective purchasers. And then there also are lurking out there, and a lot of people don't realize this, is that there are a lot of large buyers out there, and who are simply looking to step into an industry, acquire a great number of smaller businesses in that industry, and maybe across the country, acquire 40, 50, 60 small businesses, all with the idea that they're going to roll them up into one and then sell it to an even larger buyer. That's a very common scenario in a host of industries. And you really have to be careful there, because obviously there's an economic disparity between the buyer and seller there. Often you'll have venture capital or hedge fund type folks who are involved with that, and there's a lot of sort of the man behind the screen in dealing with those buyers. But there's enormous risk in dealing with your competitors as well, obviously, because your competitor is going to all of a sudden want a bunch of information about your business. And if the sale doesn't go through, now they can use all that information from a competitive standpoint against you. So you really, really have to be protective about how you're going about finding an interested buyer and deal with people you trust. That sounds like a naive concept, but it's critical for advancing a good sales scenario.
David, which areas of these three do you see as being the most active as far as generating the interested buyer?
Yeah, I would say it's probably 80 to 90% are probably by competitors and large buyers together. Tough to divide those up. Brokers, I would say, in the closely held world, there's not that many on a percentage basis, so maybe only 10% or so are those. But competitors, what I consider what we call strategic buyers, and then large buyers, I would guess is 85 to 90% of the interested buyers out there. And so certainly it's easy to find the competitors. Sometimes it's harder to find the large buyers out there. But what you typically see in the large buyers is they will have acquired other smaller businesses, maybe even in the area, and so you learn who in that industry is starting that process, or maybe even in other states. We see that from time to time. But I would say the vast majority pair are in the competitors and large buyer scenario.
Do you see when the large buyers are interested, and you mentioned about the difference in the bargaining power, do you see the price for the buyer going down a bit because the large buyer is really using that advantage, that size?
Yeah, no, it's funny because I see that when you have a very weak seller, and that weak seller maybe is a much older owner who doesn't have a succession plan in place. Then sometimes you will find those large buyers who are really taking advantage of the situation. But most of the time, I see it, in fact, in the opposite way. What they really are doing, in order to get the buyer to sell, they know they have to write a good sized check. And it's always interesting to me that, the buyer is somewhat surprised. My goodness, I didn't think my business was worth that much. And large buyers, I find to be, first of all, they have the resources to do it, but I don't find them taking advantage because they can't. They have to entice, if you will, by large checks. So I'm always very interested that unless the seller is weak, those large buyers typically write even a larger check than a competitor.
So a little premium is involved.
I think so. I'd be interested to I'm sure there would be some numerical analysis we could do to see what that premium is. But I think there absolutely is a premium associated with that. So you've made the decision to sell, and now you think you found an interested buyer. What in the world do we do next? And so here's the typical process is the prospective purchaser and the seller enter into a confidentiality agreement. Because now all of a sudden, confidential, sensitive, perhaps even proprietary information is going to get exchanged. So think financial information. How is the seller doing? And the buyer is always looking, and this is the thing that sellers need to understand, is what that buyer is buying. Yes, there can be some strategic reasons behind it, but by and large, they're buying an income stream. And so what the buyer wants to know is, how certain is that income stream? Can I count on it? So if you have a seller, for example, who only has one or two customers, think of in the aerospace industry, where you have a machine shop that may be manufacturing parts for Boeing. If Boeing is the 90% of the business, all of a sudden Boeing goes somewhere else, and now all of a sudden that business is worthless. So a diversification of customers is critical. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, because that customer mix might be part of the confidential information that's being exchanged. Information about the owners and the families involved, or the employees that are involved. this is super confidential information, and you can imagine if you're disclosing this information to a competitor, information about employees, information about product lines and challenges that the business has, and financial information, that information goes to a competitor. That competitor might be able to use that to the disadvantage of the deal of the seller if the deal doesn't go through. Confidentiality agreements are one way that sellers can protect themselves. And so things to think about are, hey, is the confidentiality, is it one way, meaning where the prospective purchaser, they have the obligation to protect the confidentiality of the information? Or does both buyer and seller have obligations arising out of that confidentiality agreement? The information that is confidential, what is it? Sometimes you have a confidentiality agreement that says only the information that is marked as confidential is going to be kept confidential. So obviously that means that when whoever is disclosing that information has to take the time to mark it. Other times it's just every bit of information that's exchanged between the parties is confidential. And then more often you see kind of a mix, and there are always exceptions that are called out for things that might be generally known by the public or be able to be learned from other sources, things of that nature. But confidentiality agreements is the next logical step. And then you have to decide, okay, well, once this confidential information is exchanged, how long do we have to preserve the confidentiality? Do we have to destroy the information that we get? If so, how do we do that? How do you destroy emails? Are those emails ever really gone? There certainly are some challenges out there about that. So a good, solid confidentiality agreement will identify the parties, will identify what is being kept confidential. It will identify who has to keep it confidential, if it's all the parties or just one of the parties, and then how long does it go? What's the term, and what happens at the end of the agreement?
How often do you see where just the mere fact that the seller is interested in selling, that fact is also considered confidential information? Because I could see where a seller might be in a situation where they don't want it known that they're being sold. Sure. Or considering selling for whatever reason. What do you think?
Yeah, no, you definitely see that, because certainly once word gets out that a sale is imminent, you have issues with employees all of a sudden of that seller, among other things. And so I would say the fact of the sale often is one of those bits of information that is confidential, sort of that I'm shopping myself, you have to keep this quiet. And so how that is going on, for example, if there's a broker involved, well, that broker's job is to sort of broadcast quietly, if that's possible, an interesting contradiction there, right?
Yeah.
But if that's possible to keep that quiet, and then you try to do that. But it is, I think that it's a challenge to do it, and it's why, as a seller, you have to be very careful of how you're out there trying to find that prospective purchaser.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking about with the mutual versus the one way, if you're selling the business, you're thinking, well, it's the seller's information, because as you said, the buyer is buying an income stream and they want to know, what does that stream look like? But maybe mutual is not quite as obvious. It seems to me that that's where a good example, I think, would be if the buyer is paying out over time, the seller is going to want to know, how strong is this buyer, and how well are they able to make those payments over the next 2 years or 10 years or whatever that time is, right? And how secure are they likely to be?
No, that's exactly right. And why I think the majority of confidentiality agreements usually are mutual. Remember, this is not a litigation setting where the parties are adverse to one another. I mean, they're adverse from the standpoint that the buyer wants to, reduce the amount of the purchase price, and the seller wants to maximize it. But really, this is a cooperative thing, and so oftentimes I think the vast majority of times the confidentiality agreements are mutual in this context. So from there, so again, we've made the decision to sell. We found a prospective purchaser. Confidential information has been exchanged within the context of a confidentiality agreement. So now buyer and seller now know a little bit more about each other. There's a certain level of trust that has developed between buyer and seller. So, okay, now what do we do? And so hopefully, we always appreciate the opportunity to be involved earlier in the process rather than later. So hopefully we've been involved in the process of drafting or reviewing the confidentiality agreement before it's signed. But certainly we need to be involved at this point, meaning, okay, we've got to know if we have a sort of a handshake deal, if you will. We know who is buying. So what are they buying? There are different structures to a transaction. For example, if you have a seller that is an S corp or a C corp, they may be selling their stock. Okay, the individual shareholders may be selling their stock. More common, though, is the seller is selling its assets. And that way, the buyer has the ability to pick and choose what assets to buy and make sure they're not acquiring any of the liabilities, where with the stock, you get all of it. And sometimes that can't be avoided. You have to buy the stock because it might be a license or a governmental obligation that can't be assigned. So sometimes the nature of the business will dictate the structure of the sale, but the letter of intent starts to pull these really big picture items together to find out if buyer and seller are really, and what I say, are they on the same planet in terms of what they're talking about? Are they on the same planet in terms of how the business is going to move forward with the sale? Are they on the same planet, most importantly, with what is the purchase price? Because what the parties don't want to do is they don't want to spend a whole bunch of time, and we'll talk about definitive documentation here in a minute, but they don't want to spend a whole bunch of time and expense with lawyers and accountants and other business folks, IT folks, trying to figure out if they can put it together if they can't even agree, if buyer and seller can't even agree on what is being purchased and what those purchase terms are. So what you do is you put together a simple letter of intent, and a letter of intent is generally not contractually binding, okay? So you have, even though it's not contractually binding, meaning if the sale doesn't go through, neither party can sue the other, but they need to have at least a handshake deal on what these major price and what is being sold points are. Because now if you can, if the letter of intent goes out and the buyer thinks they're getting 10 million and the seller is only willing to pay 3, that is such a wide gap that there's no reason to talk anymore. But if, hey, we're pretty close, and then you keep working at it to push that through. And oftentimes there's a bridge between what the seller wants to sell for and the buyer wants to pay to buy by using what we call an earnout to bridge that gap. I don't want to get too far into the weeds of that, but oftentimes the letter of intent will, again, on a non-binding standpoint, identify those big picture deal points, when closing will be, things of this nature, so people can start planning their lives. Includes maybe some major contingencies that might be identified. Typically, I don't see too many of those in an LOI, but there are some things that are binding, and typically there are 2 things where there is a contract involved in the letter of intent, and that is the continuing obligation of confidentiality between the parties and exclusivity. Meaning, once the letter of intent is signed, the seller can't go out and continue to shop the business, because the buyer wants to know, hey, we're going to be expending a bunch of resources to get this deal done. We want to make sure you're not taking this letter of intent, going to another prospective purchaser, and basically cutting the knees out from underneath the seller. So that's typically what the LOI is used for in general, and it's a relatively inexpensive tool to see if the parties really have the basis to eventually arrive at a meeting of the minds about what their deal is.
But as you say, it really is important to distinguish that you've got an LOI that in large part you couldn't bring a breach of contract action on, but if the confidentiality and exclusivity, and there could be some other provisions that are binding, you are going to be able to, under the right circumstances.
Yeah, that's right. But and what a lot of times people don't understand is that, well, I'm just going to sign this letter of intent because I'm not bound by the price terms, and so I'll try to negotiate the price down or negotiate the price up once the LOI is signed, and that rarely happens. Even though it's not binding, you can imagine, hey, we agreed on this $1 million price, and now the seller says they want 2 million. Well, what has changed? And that and you just, from a practical perspective, not from a legal perspective, but from a
Right.
practical perspective, it's just really hard to change those major deal points once there's agreement in principle.
Yep.
So then from now, again, where are we in the process? Made that emotional decision to sell. We found a prospective purchaser. We've gotten a confidentiality agreement, and information has been exchanged. Now we've signed a letter of intent. We have a handshake deal on what the price is and whether we're selling stock or assets. Well, now, and from a lawyer's perspective, now there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And so what we get involved in what's called drafting the definitive documentation. And so that's where now we're really getting down into the weeds and dealing with everything from the assets that are being sold and what's not being sold, the liabilities that are being assumed, how working capital is going to be dealt with, the representations and warranties that are being made for the buyer to rely upon, what kind of indemnification and holdbacks there might be to protect the buyer, things of that nature, all now need to be worked out. So there can be things like escrow agreements. Certainly employment agreements will be a part of this for the seller, the humans that were involved in the seller to work for the buyer post-closing. In a stock deal, you have similar kinds of arrangements. This is why we use the term definitive documentation. That's a very broad term for a whole host of documents that may need to go. Yes, there'll be a purchase document, but there will be a bunch of other documents typically as well. And the other thing that happens is part of the definitive documentation is there's a great deal of due diligence that the buyer is going to want to do. And so there are a number of schedules that will be attached. And so everything from medical insurance is disclosed, and the employees and what the employees are paid, and what the healthcare insurance looks like, and the 401k or whatever retirement plan is in place. It can really be a massive undertaking. And that's why it's important for the seller to be super, super organized, so they have access to all of their customer contracts and all of their internal workings and how their IT works, because the IT of the seller has to work with the IT of the buyer. And so this, after the LOI gets signed, you work through all of these things, because that buyer is going to come in at closing and now start running that business, and so they have to know it all. And it's a bit of a challenge, because a lot of these deals are what we call sign and close deals, meaning at the time that the definitive documentation is signed, closing happens at the same time. So you never really know if you have a deal until it's already closed. Occasionally, you also have the deal where you sign today, but closing doesn't happen for 30 or 60, 90 days. Why? Because the buyer has to work out their financing, whether it's SBA or other things. And so that doesn't happen as often, but certainly it's a major aspect. And that's where we as lawyers spend a lot of time, and it can be quite expensive in comparison to the LOI. And so that's why you do an LOI first, so you don't spend a whole bunch of money on definitive documentation when you don't really think you have a deal. So that's a critical.
Given the various things that you're looking at and could be involved, do you see much difference in the amount of documentation that has to be prepared for a stock sale versus an asset sale, or is there a big difference in the number of documents that actually have to be done?
Yeah, I don't think there's that much of a difference in the number of documents. I mean, still everything has to be disclosed. It's a major transaction for both parties, and they're different certainly. But in terms of the amount, the cost aspect of it, I mean, the different costs from a tax perspective. But I don't think from the amount of documentation, stock sale versus asset sale, I don't see that as a major distinction.
Yeah.
So now what everybody wants to get to is they want to get to closing. Well, what in the world's closing? What do we mean by closing? Well, that's where the cash goes. to the seller, and the assets or stock goes to the buyer. But there's other stuff that happens. There's typically indemnification, where the seller indemnifies the buyer for everything that happened at the business prior to closing, and the seller indemnifies the buyer for everything after closing. And so sometimes there's a part of the purchase price.
Vice versa.
I'm sorry, I said it backwards, didn't I?
Yep.
Thanks for listening closely, Per. I was
Yeah.
talking too fast. So in any event, there might be a fund set aside basically as an amount of insurance to cover any of those breach of indemnifications where the seller, ran the business and turns out, 6 months before closing, there was an injury or there was a tax problem. Hey, look, that seller, you still have to take care of that. And similarly, after closing, if somebody should knock on the seller's door because they think they own the business, well, they don't. The buyer needs to take care of the seller on that standpoint. But also, usually what you have is the owners of the business, who are the sellers, they need to be involved in some post-closing transition issues. That might be something as simple as being available on the phone, or more complicated, like remaining employed for 6 months or a year or longer with the buyer. And those things are all negotiated in the definitive documentation. So the closing part is the fun part. The post-closing transition may not be fun, but at least people have gotten the deal done, and so usually there's some good cooperation between the parties. So it's quite a process. We love getting the opportunity to be involved with everything. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. We certainly, Per and I get to do a lot of these deals, and they're a lot of fun. And so certainly we would be happy to help you with yours. So give us a call if we can help. Again, my name is David Tingstad Per Oscarsson. We're at Beresford booth, and be thrilled to help you with either your purchase or the sale of your business. With that, our time is up for the day. And so stay tuned because next Wednesday at 12:15, there'll be another webinar that will be presented right here, and this will also be up on our YouTube channel. So thanks, appreciate you tuning in.